Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Jonathan Duprat, CCO at Artorias.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we're joined by a good friend of ours, Pyotr. Pyotr, welcome aboard.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's a great show, and I'm very delighted to be on to be part of your conversation. Looking forward to it.
Awesome, Pyotr. Well, I know a lot of the topics that you focus on, and I was actually recently in your YouTube channel. For those who are interested, it's called The Global Gambit. It's on YouTube. It's a phenomenal channel. Highly recommend that everybody goes check it out. And a lot of the things that you focus on and specialize is kind of this global, power competition, and the way that you and and a lot of us have, interacted was related to Russia, Ukraine. And there's a lot of reporting coming out, and the Munich Security Conference is about to start, and there's reporting coming out that Trump is going to propose kind of a peace plan to try to end this almost 3-year war. And I wanted to get your initial reaction and see, do you think that this is a viable plan? Do you think that the Russians would agree to it? Do you think the Ukrainians are going to agree to it? What is your initial reaction on this proposed peace plan and its viability?
Yeah, I mean, from my background, what I try to do on the Global Gambit is cover everything. That's why I call it the Global Gambit, because everything is interconnected. And having worked in the UN for a few years, the World Bank, lived in Africa and studied sort of great power politics and economics, is that we're seeing a fundamental shift, I think, in the international order. Now, when people watch podcasts or listen to podcasts and the news and things, and they hear something quite as grandiose as that, it can seem perhaps a little bit, overzealous. But the fact of the matter is, we are seeing a fundamental shift in how power is distributed around the world, the way that countries, be them bigger or small, are interacting with each other. And I think it's, shall we say, captivated almost, or captured rather, in what Trump is proposing, which, I mean, I was reading an article in the FT, in the Guardian, in the run-up to our conversation, and you've got the Munich Security report in preparation for sort of the developments there, saying that the US is now seen as a risk. The once country that was, argued to be the hegemon, the unipower, or the hyperpower is now, well, undermining the very thing that it was meant to do, which was to be the global stabilizing force. And I think it's very clear that the deal itself, or the plan at least, doesn't really favor Ukraine at all. Trump wants to wrap up, in my opinion, the conflict as soon as possible, or at least stabilize it to a point where he can focus on his arch enemy or rival, which is China. China is obviously much more of a capable, potent force than Russia is, and whether or not Putin likes to, to quote some analysts who focus on Russia, throw the toys out of the pram. Russia is a reckless power that wants to regain its relevancy as a great power, although I don't really understand how a country with over 6,000 nukes could not be considered important to pay attention to, versus China, which is a lot more systemic and changing things gradually. And so Trump's plan is also, I think, reflective of his priorities for one, but also that he genuinely sees things through power politics. He doesn't really think that Ukraine is that important to his grand strategy, to his interests, be it America first or just broader economics, right? And ultimately, this is reflective of which other people? Strongmen. It's no secret that Trump has a, shall we say, slight admiration for Putin or Xi in whatever bizarre ways that he does, but he does think that they get things done. And as Putin refers to Washington in any rhetoric, it's never about Kiev. Kiev is just the sort of country that's stuck in the middle. Putin's focus is America. Much Trump does the same. He talks to the heads of state of the bigger powers. So I think that this peace plan is reflective of just how Putin approaches international relations, how he sees the world. And while in the first term he didn't have something of this magnitude to deal with, he's in a much more stronger position. He's got a centralized control over the state. He's got centralized control over the House and Senate. And he's able to leverage that much more effectively now. So I think it's going to be extremely interesting to see how things pan out in the Munich Security Conference. But ultimately, I don't think, it's going to make much difference in terms of what people say. Trump's going to do what Trump wants, and ultimately it's what Moscow says, and Kiev will unfortunately be quite stuck. I don't think, the last point I'd say is I don't think the conflict's going to come to an end just because of this peace plan. We saw the Chinese proposal 2 years ago, and that did nothing. So I think it's just a case of whether or not Trump can force or encourage Kiev to fall in line, which I don't think they will, and why people get it fundamentally wrong. The Ukrainians will fight to defend themselves because they see it as an existential threat. So yeah, it's a challenging situation, and this is going to be part of that.
Well, and to that point, when we listen to Trump, everything seems very transactional. So if you listen to him talk about Ukraine, there's this framing around mineral rights. If you listen to him talk about what's going on in Gaza, it's about development and real estate. So I think that's very concerning, and it should be concerning for the global community.
It is. I mean, it's a difficult one, right? Because I think we've gotten, and I plan to make a video on this myself, but labels in modern politics have largely lost all meaning. People label me because I'm an internet someone who's worked at the UN or the World Bank or something like that as a globalist, but they don't really know what that means. And I'm not really a globalist. I don't agree with everything that the World Economic Forum does, right, to bring up some of the more conspiratorial aspects. But I am an internationalist. I do believe in international cooperation. I do believe in fundamental principles like the rule of law, or that I personally would prefer to live in a democracy, not an autocracy. But I do think sometimes transactionalism has its place. If you're going to preach, and I'm thinking of Biden when he was coming into office and he said he would make Saudi Arabia a pariah state, well, that didn't go very well for Biden, did it? He ended up having to coddle up to the Saudis even closer than you can argue Trump did in his first term. So you've got to be intelligent and tactful about how you preach your desires or preferences for certain things like rule of law, like democracy, like human rights. Because if you don't, and you uphold regimes or systems of governance, as we've seen the Americans do, not just the Americans, but Western countries do time and again, that gets under the skin. That puts a bad taste in people's mouths. And that's why I think there is such a anti-American, anti-Western rhetoric, right? That's what the BRICS symbolizes for many people, is the alternative to a US-led order. And so Trump's transactionalism in certain contexts might be a little bit more effective. We're going to cover Africa later in the conversation. And, from my experience living out there, African states appreciate the desire to deal based on just transactional terms without the added elements of, well, you've got to do this and got to do that. And that's why, you could argue China has done as well as they have with their Belt and Road Initiative across parts of the continent. Of course, Africa is not a monolith, and there's lots of nuances and differences there. But the point, I think, remains the same, which Trump is bringing in a slight, less of a multilateralist approach like Biden did, less of a liberal interventionist approach like Obama has, and less of a neocon approach like Bush has. And maybe some countries will see that as we've seen countries celebrating or congratulating Trump. Whether or not you want them to be congratulating them in the case of Putin is obviously not, well, up for debate. But I think the point is it depends. In some ways, obviously, I stand by most of those things. I am a multilateralist in many ways. I'm supportive of the liberal world order to an extent, but I also understand where you might have to be a little bit more strategic in that regard. Last example I'll give is we have partners like Vietnam, like Mexico, like other countries in Africa, which you might not see as being democracies. But ultimately, if you want to counterbalance, it plays into this great power politics again. If you want to counterbalance against the Chinese vis-a-vis Taiwan, you need the Vietnamese, you need Thailand, you need countries that make up the first and second island chains and are angry about the 9-dash-lane claims of China. India is a democracy, and many people in the West see it as a incredible increasingly illiberal democracy because Modi centralizes power and punishes minorities and so on. But Indians will argue, who are you, Westerners, to tell us how to run our democracy? So it's a fine balancing act, and exactly why international relations is so important, but also I think fundamentally misunderstood in the modern age.
Well, and
So
you
if I-
you bring up the 9 dash line, the cow's tongue, and you also brought up balancing. And I think one of the prime examples of that is Marco in the Philippines has been much more open to working with the United States because there is this existential threat. And I think that caught a lot of people in international relations off guard.
Yeah, I would say on the Philippines, I mean, if you look at any poll such as Pew Research, the latest one I saw, I think from a couple of years ago, the Filipinos are absolutely infatuated with the US. 83% of the Filipino population have a positive view of America. And in Trump's first term, we had, I think I'm going to butcher his name, but Duarte, who was obviously quite anti-America, quite anti the West, or just anti-democracy. And so it shows you that the shift in governance is a critical one, and into, shall we say, independent personal relations of heads of state is crucial. So these things do ebb and flow. But yeah, if America internalizes and a set of countries think that they can't rely on the United States in that way, then that can be a worry. The point I'd also add on to that is just look at the way that Trump utilizes tariffs. Again, I sort of understand that you want to use tariffs as a way to foster domestic industry. I try to be fair on my show by acknowledging other grievances or perspectives. But ultimately, if you're going to tariff your own allies, right? Trump's talking about retaliatory tariffs, and this is going to be a big talking point at the Munich Security Conference. If you're going to do that against your own allies and partners, well, what does that do for the optics and view of the dependability and reliability of the United States? That's going to undermine the Philippines and a bunch of countries in the Southeast Asian area that have been, more on the line, more aligned to the US perspective or idea of governance, world order, than the Chinese. But if they keep doing that, then they'll be like, well, maybe we can get a slightly reduced tension with the Chinese and work with them better, right? It doesn't play into the long-term strategic goals and interests of the Americans, and that's why I think it's such a long-term bad play. So yeah.
So Peter, if I can go just to end on the Munich Security Conference, because I think one of the interesting aspects, because you guys touched upon this on kind of this mineral ore thing, and to kind of make the argument I think that you might hear from Republicans, is there is this idea of peace through strength, and it'd be interesting to see Putin's overall objectives, because I think there is still, Putin has indicated that he still has this maximalist objective, but I think from this transactional piece is like, okay, you give us rare earth, because I think you can tie that directly to China and kind of the monopoly they have there, and there's this inherent national security interest that the Ukrainians have said, that they would follow along, where mineral rights to the United States in exchange for continued weapons. And so it'd be interesting to see if how does Putin approach this ceasefire? Because or peace deal, because Putin hasn't kind of died down from his maximalist objectives. But one of the interesting aspects, and this was kind of mentioned by the national security advisor to President Trump during the Sunday talk show host, there was a piece where it ended, and I kind of think it frames this aspect of global relations, right, in the United Nations as a whole, is that there was this conversation that any guarantors for Ukraine, like the military force necessary for that, would have to come from the Europeans. The national security advisor said this has to be led by the Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
And so, please, kind of talk about, if you want to touch upon Putin and his maximalist objectives. But I find this very interesting, where we're starting to see this trend that's been going on for a couple of years now, where regional bodies like the European Union, like the African Union, we can even touch upon Israel and Gaza, where there's now this push of more regional focused peacekeeping missions, either through existing organizations like the European Union and the African Union, or multinational countries getting to agreement, maybe possibly we'll see in Gaza, because right now it's just contractors are doing it. But it's kind of this shift away from what we saw in the 90s and 2000s, which was, UN peacekeeping mission forces, where that was how you would kind of end wars. It was through UN peacekeeping missions. Even during the Cold War, we could argue they're effective or not, but everybody would go to UN peacekeeping missions. And that seems to have been now transitioning to this European Union, African Union, regionally, like it's almost like the UN has taken a back seat in these negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, you've made me actually write some things down there, Stefano, because there's so much to consider. I think one point I would make in the context of Ukraine is that it kind of goes back to what I was saying to the one of my other replies, which is that this is where I do agree with Trump's more, I don't know if transactionalism is the right element of it, but there has been a free riding issue. I 100% agree with him on that. European nations need to step up. We've seen historically the reduction and sort of overlooking of military defense, whatever expenditure by European states for the best part of 30 years. Funny that maybe it's because of the US hegemonic status for the past 30 years, but the European nations shouldn't have done that. And it took well, we saw it in 2014. European nations still didn't step up and think, oh, goodness, Putin's resorted to hard power in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. He annexed a part of a sovereign state. And I know the complex relationship of Crimea to Russia and Ukraine, but still, right? That was not enough of a kick in the teeth for European nations to be like, oh, maybe we should begin to think about, militarizing a bit more, modernizing our militaries at least, or talking about interoperability with NATO. And it's taken the first, well, great war, if you like, or major conflict on European soil since the Second World War to be like, oh, okay, we should do something. I've hosted speakers, including notable historian Sir Lawrence Freedman, emphasizing the point that he makes that might is right. It's back, right? You don't resort to soft power and diplomacy. We'll bring in the UN in a second. We resort to military coercion, threats, and hard power. Right, you've got a 51st state, probably, well, possibly a 54th state. Tongue-in-cheek jokes about Canada, Panama, and Greenland. Right, what is going on? We don't expect this from the President of the United States. We expect it from, well, revanchist powers like Russia and revisionist powers like China. So it's extremely disconcerting on that regard. And so in that area, I think that Trump has a point. But other than that, yes, you are seeing a deviation away from what we've been thought of as multilateralism. I don't think the UN, I'll say it quite bluntly, the UN is not going to die. I don't think it is. It's much more comprehensive and globally established than the League of Nations ever was. But it is seeing a significant reduction in funding from the United States now. The US makes up 20% plus of UN funding overall, I think. And if Trump doesn't want to leverage it, then where does that leave the United Nations? I personally have always stood by the belief that it should be the overarching vehicle, if you want, or platform whereby, nation states come together to discuss and establish global norms and values or whatever policy. But it's up to regional entities, governments to implement those policies. It's obviously challenging to get that balance right, and it's that distribution of power or the tug of war between how much sovereignty a nation state has and how much we're talking about global governance and stuff like that. But ultimately, I welcome more regional institutions or bodies like the EU, like ASEAN, like the Arab League, taking the initiative on knowing what's best to deal with an issue, with a dilemma, with a crisis. In the UN, there's been expressions locally led, locally owned. Obviously, you can insert a specific country or issue into the local bit, but and I think it's the best way because one thing I learned from working in the World Bank is like countries were fed up, communities were fed up with being prescribed what a bunch of policymakers or academics across a bunch of oceans thought was best for them, right? We talk about the structural adjustment programs of the 80s. That didn't work well. So they have the knowledge in terms of the academia, they have the know-how, but they don't have the local knowledge. And so it's this multifaceted, stakeholder-led, if you like, I'm throwing on all the buzzwords, that is the right way to go about it. And I think that this dissolution of responsibility or decentralization is good. The problem is making sure it doesn't happen to too much of an extent that people are like, well, then what's the United Nations for? And my countenance to that, or counter argument to that, is that we see how much nations do value the UN, right? When the Iranians were undergoing the exchange of missile fire with the Israelis last year over a couple of times, they didn't send a direct communique to the Israelis or to the US. They sent it via the UN. When China is undertaking its efforts to see Taiwan increasingly, reduced recognized as a sovereign state, where did they do that? They do that by influencing the language of the products and communiques that come out from the United Nations. So even, the Chinese see the UN as a very important organization, entity that helps facilitate their rise as a great power, or as the ultimate other, pole in this duopoly, if you like. Again, of course, it's more nuanced than what I'm trying to fit into a brief podcast, but the UN has a role, but I think for specific issues of a specific nature, the African Union, ASEAN, and so on, all have their role to play. It's about getting that balance right. But in the current world that we're living in, or direction that we seem to be going in, last point of, power politics, great power competition. There was an article by the FT earlier today. The images of Donald Trump sitting at a table with Xi and Putin about to carve up the world, right? That is not the world that the UN is supposed to be operating in. So it's going to be very difficult to see how the UN can remain as vigilant and influential as it has been in certain ways, for better or worse.
And
You know,
so,
oh, go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
yeah, so I was just going to ask you, when we look at Xi, Putin, Trump, one of the things that, I would argue personally that the Security Council is the most important mechanism within the UN, but we have this pesky veto power. And how do you actually cope with that? What are some of the things that we could do that might actually push the Security Council or the UN in a direction where they could get things done without having to worry about Russia, the United States, or China vetoing these measures or any measure?
Well, I mean, sort of the way you framed it is sort of one way of putting it, right? Very soft way. It's whenever people talk about the United Nations, right? They just talk about the UN as though it's a singular entity. Oh, you should defund and dissolve the UN. Okay, guys, well, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. I'm going to go talk to someone else, right? It's very frustrating because a lot of people have opinions about stuff, but they don't understand how it works. The UN is not a monolith. It is a multitude of different agencies, funds, programs, systems, all with their own, you can argue, power structures, right? The IMF is a separate entity to the World Bank, but they're part of the UN system. But what most of the time people are talking about is either the Security Council or the General Assembly, and conflate the two terribly. And it's very frustrating as someone who, and I'm not beginning to say I'm an expert of the UN remotely, but having worked in it in and out for the past few years, yeah, you have a greater clarity. So yeah, the veto power is what we all think about. First and foremost, the UN Security Council is about, its mandate or focus is about ensuring stability and peace around the world. If you want economics and other specific areas, then you go to, the UN Population Fund. You go to the General Assembly if it's more about just general governance. The UN Economic and Social Council, right? There are different bodies for different elements. But because security and peace are arguably the underpinning of anything else, that's, you can't have improvements in human rights until you ensure a stable political and security system environment. So yeah, so right now we had, at the end of last year, the United States under Biden making uncharacteristically, excuse me, names and vibes that there would be a reform or review of the Security Council. Now, the French have said this before, the British surprisingly muted, and the Russians and the Chinese sort of say stuff. But the point is, and this kind of plays into the US, Western sort of, double standards thing I was talking about before, but it's applicable to the Russians and the Chinese as equally much, which is that all those countries benefit from the system as it is. So when we talk about, oh, we want to see, we're tired of the United States dominance, we want to see the Indians given more representation. Okay, Beijing and Moscow. Right, okay, so you're going to give up your veto power, are you? Oh, someone's gone very quiet, right? Because none of them want to. right? The French and the British are not the powers that they were 50, 80 years ago. And so, a lot of people think, why are they on the council? Look at what Britain's doing with the Chagos Islands, likely just giving them up. I personally don't think we should, not because I don't want to see the Chagarian people free with their ability to live on their land, but because it's such a security dynamic that's important. It's a tough one. It's human rights versus security interests. It's, you can watch any Netflix documentary or series about that, right? So none of these countries are going to willingly and easily just say, yeah, sure, let's reform the council, let's give up our vetoes. I don't think you'll ever see, realistically speaking, look, you're never going to see the veto power gone. What I do think would be cool, but still quite hard to do, is sort of more mechanisms to dilute its power. Right now, it's veto and that's it. Well, why can't we have a collective suspension system whereby if enough members of the Security Council, be them permanent or elected members, which are on 2-year cycles, vote that one of the members is abusing its veto power, then it's frozen out of a vote or it's suspended for a certain period of time, right? It's not kicked off the council, but it's limited in its ability to fling the veto, or you get, 5 vetoes a month, right? Again, this sounds all great in theory, but it's very hard to implement. And the problem is, you can get policies and suggestions put through, like gaining statehood. The Palestinians, arguably we can talk about that, for example, that you go through the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly, if you get 2/3, then that passes the General Assembly, which is the actual representation of the international community, of all the 190 plus nations. But then where does it have to go for ratification and to be agreed upon? Security Council. So it's not really that fair, is it? So that's why the Palestinians never bother to try and push for statehood, for example, because they know that it's just going to be shot down by the Americans at the behest of the Israelis. So again, to reform the Security Council, it has to go through the General Assembly, but then with the sort of writing off, if you want, or signing off of the Security Council. That's not going to happen. So one colleague I've had, Richard Gowen, who's arguably my go-to guy for UN-related matters at International Crisis Group, and I've had on the show, he says it's better to focus on areas where you can actually get change. Continue to lobby the General Assembly to have more power and try to dilute the opportunities of the Security Council. Too much emphasis is almost put on the Security Council because it's the sexy sort of, the security bit. But really, we need to find maybe not limiting the Security Council, but increasing the power of other organs and bodies, because the Security Council is incredibly difficult. And I don't think any government in the next 10 years is going to be the one willing to take that step. Sorry to be, rain on your parade there.
No, I tend to agree. And I mean, I think it's right there. In the United States, if there's a veto, there's the opportunity to override it. But again, how do you actually get that implemented? So point well taken. Thank you.
Before we move on from the peacekeeping bit, I think we should bring up like the transition from where peacekeeping was, since, Stefano, you brought up a good point. 20, 30 years ago, it was working rather well. But 20, 30 years ago, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. Russia was finding its footing. And that's not to say that they were trying to act in their own interest. If you look at the Balkan conflicts, Russia was very much acting in its own interest within the framework of those peacekeeping missions. And that does lead to situations like, I believe it was Pristina Airport, where NATO forces and Russian forces, had a little bit of a clash. That everyone was operating in their own interest. And the Chinese had not yet found, at least in the 1990s, had not yet found what they wanted to be in the world. Obviously, that has changed by now. So peacekeeping missions in the United Nations, I would argue they worked in a very specific context of when they were all happening. The majority of the modern missions did start in the immediate post-Cold War period. And since then, they have reduced not just in quantity, but also in scope.
Yeah, I would just add 2 cents on this, which is that for a long time there's been an emphasis on peacekeeping, which you can argue is more about short-term military intervention. But there needs to be a shift away from this towards more peace building, the long-term collaborative process that addresses the root causes of a conflict. Increasingly, some people will say it's all a hoax, but climate change is a driver of conflict, of intercommunal violence, as we see across Africa with Nigeria and herd of farmer conflicts, from the rise of al-Shabaab in, or should we say the sustained support for al-Shabaab in Somalia. and even in Mozambique and the Northeast. These have been driven arguably by climate change because of rising sea levels, ocean acidification, a reduction in fish stocks, and therefore it pushes certain communities towards, they get preyed upon by these groups. So peace building needs to be more about addressing the root causes than it is simply by sending in military entities to try to stabilize it in the short term. The other point I would also make is that the R2P doctrine was very important. It's never really been sort of leveraged, I think, in an effective way or incorporated into the thought process of sort of subsequent missions. But during the 90s, and this isn't an endorsement of everything that happened during the Yugoslav wars, but the UN did try some different initiatives, and I feel that peacekeeping or the peace element of the UN has never really been modernized and fleshed out more. Creating safe zones, creating more initiatives, which doesn't mean necessarily just sending in a bunch of troops to try to use force or whatever coercion to intimidation tactics to get the aggressor or whatever to back down. There are more, I think, clever ways that it can be leveraged. And it's a shame that we don't see that being explored more within the UN itself. And I think that's where, back to the broader point about regionalization and the UN's role, I think that the UN has that role in sort of information sharing, developing new ideas, testing out policies, and understanding how, a peace mission in one region might be different to another, but what are the best practices we can take from both and apply to ensure that they're more successful ultimately.
And
Yeah.
R2P being responsibility to protect.
Yes.
Yes.
So I just assume everybody knows what I mean.
No worries. And you talk about the Yugoslavian conflicts and sort of the UN's role, but if we think about the intervention from the United States, that was not mandated by the UN. It was more of a situation where you have this coalition of the willing, which happens a lot with some of these interventions, say Libya, for example. And they didn't ask permission, and they felt it was better to then ask for forgiveness. And Kofi Annan at the time, or later on, sort of gave it to them. But that's not really the way it should work under the UN. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to make it very clear that this isn't some kind of unlimited love and awe for the UN. The UN has gotten a serious amount of things wrong. The Rwanda genocide, Srebrenica massacre in 95. These are two catastrophic failures in protection of civilians. So yeah, I do agree with you to an extent that lessons need to have been learned. But that's my point. I think that the mandate and the policy, the overall policy framework when it comes to peacekeeping, if you want to focus on that, right? We tried to see more of a multi-dimensional aspect of it done in the 90s, but it sort of wasn't really expanded from in terms of an operational sense. The handbook, the playbook hasn't really changed. And we've seen that in Africa with the failings in the Sahel, in MONUSCO, in AMISOM in the 90s, right? These are all elements, but at the same time, and it goes back to something that I challenged Richard with in a podcast a couple of years ago, which is, well, then what's the purpose of the UN? And he said, well, quite simply, when the Taliban took back Afghanistan, no country was willing to engage with them. No country, no head of state wants to be the one that seems to be legitimizing, an arguably insurgent/terrorist group. So who was left? It was the United Nations. It was NAMA, right? The United Nations Assistant Mission to Afghanistan. They were the only group of individuals or whatever professionals who were willing to do so. So there is a role for peacekeeping and peace, I don't know, security operations more broadly, if you want to put it like that, that I think we need to continue to keep in mind as well.
So I think that might be a good point to sort of pivot over. So you mentioned MONUSCO in the DRC, and you were talking about the Sahel, which would be MINUSMA. And when we look at those two projects, those missions, it doesn't seem that the UN really has the capability of sustaining those without external support. So I think the perfect example there would be MINUSMA. When Operation Barkhane, which was run by the French, started to pull out from the region, we started to see all these juntas in, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. they lost a lot of that support. They lost the most crucial aspect, which was the helicopters that the French were providing, and they weren't able to make up for it. Germany tried for a little while, but at the end of the day, that resulted in the end of the mission because Germany could not provide the same level of support. So this is coming from an external partner, sort of. But Barkhane was very much designed for the French interests and paired off with the United States through the air bases 101 and 201 in Niamey and Agadez in Niger. But without that support, it really fell apart. And MINUSCO in the DRC was pretty much threatened by the same type of failings. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine pulled out the 8 helicopters that they had provided to the mission, and they lost very vital access to logistics, recon, transport, and so forth. And we've seen the situation that we talked about last week in Goma and how it's deteriorated so quickly. How can the UN, especially because after what happened in Mogadishu with the United States, Black Hawk Down, you won't see those powers really stepping up to the plate unless it's from outside of the UN. They might provide support, but the UN itself doesn't seem to have a viable mechanism to maintain these projects without that outside support.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the biggest parts of this whole conversation we're having, right? I literally shared a video earlier before we started talking about, the tug of war between state sovereignty but also global governance, or how much it's the EU, how much should power be in the hands of Brussels and what some people see as unelected bureaucrats and officials, or versus the, national governments and leaders that are voted by populations. And that's what I see. That's what I think we see with the resurgence of populism, albeit it's different in certain countries. And you can argue, what does populism mean? There's obviously debates around concepts and terms, but it's the same with the UN. And unfortunately, the situation in Sahel was a mess. When the French first started getting involved in early 2012, 13, it was the French wanted to be seen as the sort of overarching force there. But the problem is that the French have their self-interests, right? This is why they want to be seen as their sort of backyard, their former colonies. And you can argue about the unique currency situation they have with the other countries, right? The I forget what the name of it is, the franc that they have in that
Francophone.
area, right? Yes, exactly. It's quite a unique sort of structure down there. Some people still see it as a neocolonialism. So that's sort of where the UN maybe has more of an optical, better suited position, because it doesn't necessarily have any nationalist or historical ties, that therefore it wants to sort of prioritize certain interests over others. The problem is, though, the UN is only as powerful as nation states will allow it to be. And if the French are going to get irritated by the UN mission in the Sahel, then they're going to veto it, right? It comes back to Security Council and the mechanisms, right? They're going to veto it, or they're going to put a spanner in the works in terms of UN policy and being held accountable. Let's say that the French conduct themselves in a way that's not necessarily adherent to international humanitarian law, right, or law of armed conflict. Then the UN is going to conduct an investigation or whatever, and that's not going to put the French in a great light. So they're going to block it, or they're going to get cross with it, and so there is this fundamental should we say, disconnect there. Then, of course, you've got the regional entities. I think we should keep in mind that this time, the period that we're talking about, the end of December 23, when MINUSCO pulled out, MINUSMA, sorry, too many acronyms. See, even a UN person gets it confusing at times. I think when they did that, it illustrated that ECOWAS was not leveraged enough. But at the same time, if you don't have that regional integration, the subset, then how on earth how do you, what's the best way to put it? Just approach it. You've got overarching elements of the United Nations. you've got the regional bodies of ECOWAS, but then you've got the different sovereign states, and you've got supranational bodies that aren't necessarily there, like the EU. The EU was trying to provide funding and stuff. So the complexities here make it incredibly difficult to know how a UN peacekeeping mission is supposed to perform. And in my opinion, I think that the UN should be the overarching, banner by which things are done through. It is the international organization which is about any of these things. And ECOWAS, if it wants to raise certain things, it should be done through the UN's channels, right? But we leverage ECOWAS in a way that, they have the local knowledge. They are the countries that are directly engaged in the fighting. The French, that is a foreign interventionary role, and ultimately they shouldn't be able to take so much of a leadership. Sure, they have one of the better trained militaries, and therefore should do, should we say, political advisement training and so on to the local forces, but they shouldn't be the one maybe leading it, because it doesn't come off right, and ultimately they don't know what the local countries, communities really need or desire. It's a very complicated one, and I think that that's ultimately why the mission didn't work out. But lastly, I'd also say because you've got foreign interference from parties that have less of a constructive goal, right? Mali wanted the French to leave, and so the French left eventually. But then the Russians come in, or specifically Wagner Group. Well, that's
But Pyotr, actually, because that's exactly where I was going to ask you a question. Because, I mean, I don't want to go, because we could all go on a very long history of the aspects of UN missions, right? And kind of the differences. And there's like UN peacekeeping forces, and then UN authorizing military actions, like, the 91 Gulf War. But if you look at Mali specifically in West Africa, I mean, there is an argument outside of the French, but the failure of the peacekeeping mission in Mali, led to a military coup because of the frustration that the military had. And I mean, there was also possibly personal grievance and personal power desire. But the failure of the UN mission enabled the military to come in and then effectively kick out the UN mission, basically saying you're not providing what you claim to provide, which enabled then Russia through Wagner to kind of step in and fill the vacuum and return to this aspect of this transactional global politics, where Wagner was deployed to fight, specifically Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliates in Africa. I mean, in Mali, excuse me, in exchange for minerals. And so the failure of the UN peacekeeping mission also enables this power grab, transactional, and even mercenaries and the Russians to try to fill the vacuum. Wouldn't you agree that if the UN peacekeeping mission was more successful, we might have a different conversation related to Mali?
Yeah, for sure. As I said, on this come across as some kind of the UN can do no wrong. Absolutely. Political mismanagement, diplomatic disagreements is part of the problem. But again, I kind of point you back to what I said earlier, which is that the UN is only as effective as the nation states allow it to be. And if you don't have multilateral diplomacy, of which is the most complex of anything you can imagine, then no wonder the UN's not going to be able to do it well. Are there problems, right? We saw what happened in Haiti with the UN mission there in 2010 in the outbreak of cholera. That's left a sustained disdain, right? Ingrained disdain by Haitians over the role of the UN and whether or not it's, only makes things worse. But now we've got a situation out there where you might actually need another UN mission. So absolutely, the situation in the Sahel has been worsened by the complexity of this situation, of which the UN itself, I don't think, did enough ground sort of analysis and understanding of like where they might be most effective. It's not a singular state; it's a cross-border combat against a very ingrained and established sort of set of foes. And I think in a way that we've seen them leverage social media as well. The UN is very slow, I would also say, with taking up new effective ways to stay relevant and sort of fluid. So no, I 100% agree with you. I think what I'm trying to emphasize mainly is that if countries are going to, get involved and put their own self, it depends how altruistic you want to be. The UN is a concept whereby we put collective interests above self-interests, but ultimately, realpolitik comes back in, and so countries, governments in the area are going to be like, well, the UN might be relevant here, but I want to exercise this thing because I'm going to get more from it in that way, and therefore the UN comes in. Sometimes maybe the UN is just not shouldn't be there in a peacekeeping role. It should be there in an administrative one. There are different tiers of peacekeeping missions, right? Maybe it should be there in a looser capacity, more providing the information, the aid, collection. I think one of the most incredible aspects of the UN is its ability to gain insightful and accurate information on the ground of what's been happening, right? You look at the reports that are provided to the UN, they're always so in depth. And even the biggest critiques of the UN will still refer to them for resources and up to date, information about a war zone or humanitarian situation. So I think it's a really pertinent question, an incredibly difficult one to know how to get right.
And so,
You know,
sorry, go ahead, John.
having worked in the UN, I absolutely can, associate with the whole slow communications and adaptability thing. But, I wanted to take a step back because we're talking definitely a lot about how the UN has failed to play a proper role in places like the DRC or, in the Sahel. But I would definitely like to bring up a mission in Africa that I think is like just masterclass in what you should be doing with UN missions, and that would be UNAMSIL, the Sierra Leone mission, which I would argue is probably one of the most successful peacekeeping and peace building missions in the past, 25 to 30 years in the region. Because it took a very harsh ethno-religious conflict and effectively brought it to an almost complete stop over the course of 10 years. Obviously, it started with a more kinetic mission, but over time, they did transition more to the peace building aspect. And the UN eventually just became a framework through which local organizations were able to come to a suitable and, at least for the past, 15 years, somewhat, if not credible, lasting peace.
No, I agree. That's a great example. You can argue also Timor-Leste, the UN mission there, that was some people see as the most successful in the history of the UN. It had about 6 missions, if I remember, including 4 peacekeeping ones before 2012. You can also talk about the UN peacekeeping operation in Cambodia during the 90s, which was pretty successful. Other people might point to, if we're focusing on Africa, Namibia between 1989 and 90, Mozambique in the early 90s as well. But also across South America, the UN has been able to curb uprisings there and situations in, say, El Salvador, Guatemala in the 90s. So I do think the UN has a role. And I think what also we forget is it's not all, I mean, the Security Council, it is about peacekeeping missions, but I also would point out sanctions. Sanctions of a multilateral sense are the most effective, right? We think of sanctions as largely a US sister approach, which, well, 90% of them are, but we've seen the effectiveness and efficacy of sanctions, say, vis-a-vis Iran in the 2000s when the multilateral sanctions were put back on. And I'm personally a fan or support to an extent reactivating those multilateral sanctions against the Islamic Republic to in light of what happened with Massa Amini and so on. But all they have to do is reactivate. I think it's a specific clause in one of the resolutions. So there are avenues by which the UN can be effective, but it's the peacekeeping missions, it's the conflict which obviously get a lot of the attention, and therefore people think that they are completely useless, which it isn't. They are one tool in the, shall we say, diplomatic/economic statecraft toolbox, of which I think done correctly is when you can see the successes, as you said, with Sierra Leone as well.
But to your point, Pyotr, because what we're actually seeing, and I think you're highlighting kind of a connective issue, which is when there's global fragmentation and great power competition at the global stage, especially between superpowers, now it's US, China, and Russia, the UN has a failure to be an effective tool, because if the Security Council can't agree, there's no way the UN can be an effective tool to as an international organization. But at the same time, one of the interesting aspects that I think is a little bit different now, and what's interesting is also being a lot led by the United States, is during the Trump administration, the U.S. is actually withdrawing from UN bodies, the World Health Organization. Now there's talks of, under the ICC is going to be sanctioned by the United States. And obviously countries like Argentina, for example, are following suit of pulling out the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Council. The United States and Israel have pulled out. And so when the United States pulls out, obviously like-minded countries, at least politically, will also pull out. And I think that's something that is very much different than what we've seen in the last 10, 20, or 30 years, where historically the United States is almost in a political situation where they're saying, the UN is cannot be saved. It's a dead organization, and there's really no attempt to try to reform it. And then the question is, does China try to mirror image that? But how effective can China be without the input of the United States, which is the largest contributor of UN funding?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it plays well into the broader themes that we wanted to talk about on the podcast. I do severely worry about the direction that we're going in. I like to be fair in acknowledging that I think the UN has its limitations, or that Trump has some points of yeah, I appreciate where he's coming from in certain regards, but I believe in internationalism. I do not think that the United States withdrawing from the WHO, or I don't know, some people have even said he might withdraw from the WTO. This is madness. We are not going to do a better job as well, I'm pretending to be a Yank for a second. Sorry, everyone, if you're offended by that, but I'm British, so, I can't not have a stab occasionally. Um, I know you're not French, it's not that bad. But anyway, this is madness. Pulling out of organizations does not help improve them. It simply means that you have less ability to protect your own interests and exert yours as well, right? There is a massive misconception in the MAGA movement that sort of by withdrawing from foreign regions, and focusing on America first, that somehow means that other countries are then going to start leaving the US alone. Like China, Russia, Iran are going to continue to interfere in American interests domestically or whatever, regardless of how Trump tries to focus on America first, right? You don't work in a vacuum, Trump, right? This is not how the world works. And so the reason why America has been able to be the undisputed hyperpower of the world is because it has leveraged its influence for better or for worse in a way that no other country has ever come close. China has what, one or two military presences abroad, a bunch of defense pacts, a couple of strategic partnerships. Name me anything that is close to what the United States has with what? It's 800 plus bases, countless alliances, and strategic partnerships. And Trump wants to sort of diminish this. It's ridiculous. So again, I'm not saying I support everything the United States has ever done. I think it's been a huge, well, the Iraq war was illegal, but you know what I mean? I can make all the same points that we hear from those sorts of talking points. So yeah, it's a real worry that I don't think the UN is going to disappear, as I say, but it could be a former husk of itself. It could be this I don't know, very sort of gutted out system that doesn't really do anything. And ultimately, when, someone else who isn't Trump comes back to power, it's been dominated by non-Western interests, and the role of democracy and rule of law. And I think so much that Western audiences and populations take for granted are gone, are evaporated, or severely diminished. So I do worry about this. Trump is prioritizing power politics, might is right, nation first, self-interests and whatever over collective interests, which again you can balance. Not saying it has to become the Americans have to give up everything that defines America, but it's the short-termism which I find so disastrous and just well, something I find hard to believe, if that makes sense.
I can definitely speak to this because, I just recently was pretty involved with the UN. You know, say what you will about the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. It's
Mm.
extremely effective in the places where it does operate at full force, that being South Asia, East Asia, mostly these days. The lack of US and even I would say European interest in programs like this in a serious capacity has led to it effectively being dominated by the trio of China, Japan, and Korea. UNDESA, it's the same situation. And then, these programs can survive without US aid, not the organization, but they can be better. So you have the U.S. leaving, for example, the Human Rights Council. That's a huge mistake in my opinion. Leaving them is not going to do anything. Staying in them is going to do something. Leaving the World Health Organization, it's the same thing. You're not really getting much done, and China will step in, and they have been stepping in, and they're doing a phenomenal job stepping in. I'll give it to them. The problem is at that point, when you try to come back, your place is gone, and you'll have to play by someone else's rule books at that point.
And I think that's
So
a really good
yeah,
point. Sorry, go. Yeah, you got me too
yeah.
motivated. I'm jumping in when it's not my turn.
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, I just wanted to add to that because I think that captures it so beautifully, right? In the time that I was working in the World Bank, we had so many internal reports, and it became very clear that there was, I mean, you could find some discussion about this in media, although it's be, institutions on the inside are quite hush hush about this sort of thing. But there was if you want, a scenification of World Bank data and policy in the sense of data was being artificially manipulated to favor China or to appease China, which said it would reduce its funding on this or that it would put, more blockages in Y. The World Bank has a lot of loans and stuff in, say, Pakistan or with Argentina, and China, because of its relationship, swap lines with the Argentinians. I know it's beginning to change now with Milei, but the point being, the Chinese were leveraging their national and economic power to force the capitulation of the World Bank and researchers. That is not right. And I'm not saying the Americans might not try to do that a little bit, but not to that extent. So, yeah, this is the thing. It's like Britain and Brexit. Leaving the EU doesn't help improve or get rid of the issues that you still have and still affect the EU, the UK to an extent, right? Migration flows and stuff, right? You make changes by remaining in the system. You can reduce your overall funding or engagement if you want, but leaving completely is just absurd and ultimately serves nothing but to what's the word? Diminish your influence and amplify the others that you seek to counterbalance against.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really important point. And if we look at the United States, they're not party to the ICC. So I'm not sure what this gambit is where they want to put these sanctions on members, on council, anyone operating within the ICC, because we don't consider ourselves a party to it, even though it was our idea. And then what we are a party to, the ICJ, it doesn't seem like we actually care about it. The famous case would be Nicaragua in 1985 or 1986, and they ruled against the United States. And Jane Kilpatrick, who was the ambassador to the UN at the time for the United States, called the ICJ a semi-legal, semi-judicial, semi-political body, which nations sometimes accept and sometimes don't. So we didn't actually hold ourselves accountable in any sort of way there, even though the ICJ was trying to. So why would you pull out of this mechanism that we don't really seem to care about the rulings anyways, but if we can use it in any sort of positive way for American or United States interests, it makes sense to sit on the sidelines. Why would you give up a veto vote? Like it's very hard to square that circle.
No, and I agree with that very much. I think that, the four of us here are, very passionate about this. And when we listen or engage with people who sort of are aware of what the UN is to sort of an extent, or even people who have no idea, it's difficult maybe for them to appreciate. And I don't mean this in a condescending sense, but it is a problem when the US, the UK as well, or even Ukraine in a couple of examples, they haven't ratified or they haven't fully adopted the systems and mechanisms which are the fundamental basis by which to enforce or hope to enforce the principles and values that said countries are pushing or preaching. I think also there is a time element here, which is, again, us four are well aware of the changing nature of the global landscape ideologically. Um, you can talk about US primacy in the past 30 years versus the Cold War, multipolarity versus unipolar. These are big buzzwords, but basically some of these institutions, right? I'm thinking the ICC, ICJ, whatever, are quite new. The idea of internationally recognized law, which is enforced or upheld by an institution, is quite new, right? So the World Trade Organization is only what, 30 years old, and it was 99, 95. So all these ideas are quite new, and so I think us in the West particularly have gotten a little bit complacent in thinking, to mention Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, and someone who I've interviewed in the past, we got to the point where we thought um, Western liberalism and capitalism was the only way forward. And what has been happening in the past 10, 15 years, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, so of course, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq added to that, was the beginning to the cracks beginning to emerge in this US led international order, rules-based order. And what we're all scrambling to make sense of now is a much more multipolar, or what one article I saw called multiplex world. And therefore, a lot of the things we might have assumed would be upheld because they make sense aren't necessarily going to be doing that like that. And is Trump simply a symbolism of that happening in the country that we assumed would be the biggest advocator of it? So I'm getting maybe a little bit too abstract now, but I think it plays into everything we've said about the role of the UN, great power competition, the role of, different regions and so on, right? More countries are becoming more powerful. It's not just the West anymore. And Africa is a very important continent to pay attention to in the coming decades, right? It's the only continent set to actually see demographic growth, not depopulation. So all these very big themes are something we have to keep our heads around, but can be quite difficult when there's so many things happening on a daily basis in politics, and why I think people can lose, the forest from the trees, or whatever the expression is, right?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. You know, sort of ending on Africa, you mentioned global warming and what we're going to see, because Africa is going to be very heavily affected by global warming, as is the rest of the world. But we saw Europe sort of crumble and turn inwards with the last immigration or migrant crisis that they faced.
Hmm.
And that is going to be small in comparisons to what might come in the future. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out in one case this isn't necessarily pertaining to global warming, but I just wanted to go back to MINUSMA because this is something that we're going to be talking about probably next week. Uh, in one case where the Security Council did not, no member exercised a veto for the intervention in Libya. And you can tie a lot of the groups like Al Qaeda in the Greater Sahel and JNIM and all of those smaller groups operating underneath those banners to that intervention. Because what happened when Gaddafi fell was a lot of the mercenaries that he had taken from the Sahel, specifically Mali, moved back into that area, and they brought this Salafist ideas with them and joined these groups and have absolutely undermined the security of the region. And I think the UN has serious problems because these are not contained, these issues, these conflicts are not contained within the borders of Mali. You see spillover in the tri-state or tri-border region between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. You see spillover from Boko Haram spilling into the south of Niger. And if we go all the way across Africa, and we're talking about Al-Shabaab, you see that
Mm.
spillover into Kenya. So there's obviously a very, very long conversation to have here. It's been a pleasure, and we would love to have you back on, especially to maybe focus in on the Africa piece there. But if you have any final words, Piotr?
No, I mean, I think it's nice to focus on Africa. I lived there for 2.5 years. I was in Kenya when the terrorist attack took place on the university in 2013, if I remember correctly. Working in Nairobi, working in UNEP, sort of, well, in a loose capacity. I was only a lowly, unpaid intern, but I learned a lot quickly about the effectiveness or not of the UN. And I think that when it comes to transnational issues, right, this is what more and more we are seeing with global matters. It's not based on nation state to nation state. There is a divergence of approach here in that people want to live within predominantly nation state systems, right? But challenges are more and more cross-border and transnational, and it's only multilateral entities like the United Nations working in tandem or with designation to more responsibility of organizations like the African Union that are best placed to approach those matters. But when you have certain leadership or governments that don't want to see the UN as a role because they think it's going to diminish their power, then ultimately the issues are never going to be resolved. And it is, to your other point about liberal interventionism and the undermining of, whether you like them or not, but regime change is certainly not something that works. That's why we have to work with the groups in power to an extent, right? The Taliban, we may not like it, but they do control Afghanistan. We're not going to see an intervention in Afghanistan. So, we work with the Taliban because they're the lesser of the two evils versus Al Qaeda, for example. Africa, I think, is the place to focus on in terms of where we can hopefully see some of these systems improved, implemented effectively. And I look forward to that episode, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to join you guys on this great podcast. I just hope that we can see the UN leveraged in an effective way, and not make things worse. But hopefully I can end on a positive note for that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Pyotr. And certainly check out his YouTube channel, Global Gambit. And this has been the bottom line up front, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.